All right, everyone. So we've started recording. So just want to make you all aware of that. Well, welcome to our protesting teach-in. This is about knowing your rights, knowing what to expect, and some best practices. My name is Rae Perryman. I'm the Director of Communications for the ACLU of Connecticut. And I am also an educator. I have a master's degree in strategic communication and advocacy. And I've been a lifelong activist. I have protested on the local, state, and national level for a long time. And longer probably. I'm getting older, I think, so I've been doing this a while now. And I have seen various uh, um, efficacy of protests, and I have seen some protests that have been extremely useful, like the Science March. I was one of the organizers for the drug policy quotient of the Science March back in 2017. And we've, of course, seen a lot of protests, and we'll talk about some of those what those protests look like. So just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things here, and then we will get started. So this meeting is intended for educational, informational, and advocacy purposes only. We are recording the meeting. Closed captioning is available, and you are welcome to be on or off camera. You will be muted until the Q&A section, and we will have a community conversation during that time. And any disruptors will be removed, not to silence you, but to protect our ability to have this conversation today. And this meeting is provided for by an advocacy expert, me, at a nonpartisan civil rights and liberties nonprofit, which is the ACLU of Connecticut. And this is intended mostly for folks that are planning to protest or have been protesting or anticipate that you're going to protest. Please feel free to use the chat, but be respectful and connect with each other really safely and intentionally. This is my professional Zoom room, so please act right so that you will be welcome back. So thanks. So and nothing in this, I am not a lawyer, and nothing in this meeting is legal advice. All right. Well, after that, let's get started. Today, Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible is co-sponsoring, and several of the groups previously mentioned before are here, and happy to see them all. So why are we here today? We are here, some of us, in response to current events, right? We are here, some of us, for various social issues. Those can be things that have come up recently, or things that some of us have been protesting for a long time. Some of us are here because we anticipate needing to protest pro-democracy protest, anti-authoritarianism, and anti-extremism protests. We've seen a rise in interest in that in the last little bit here. Other reasons we might be here. Some folks like to protest the separation of church and state, or corporations and state, as we've seen this weekend around the world. Some of you are here because you're already ready to be involved in upcoming protests. And some of you are here because you want to know your rights and to know what's effective. It was very important to me as a student of protests and a student of advocacy movements, making sure that we know what's effective. So why is the ACLU of Connecticut the organization that's having this teach-in today? Because we are nonpartisan and we are agnostic about your reasons for protesting. We are here to make sure that you understand why you protest and what your rights are. But we are not here to tell you how to protest or what to protest. And so we don't have, we are sort of agnostic about why you're here. Many of you are here for many various reasons. Also, the ACLU, our colleagues nationwide, we are the lawyers that are representing Mr. Mahmoud Khalil, which is the protester who was arrested in early March at Columbia University. We have filed suit in his case. And right now we are waiting, I think, to see where the trial will be, or where his case will be. The other reason for ACLU of Connecticut is we're responding to direct requests and demand. I was doing a Know Your Rights for protesters at Sacred Heart University, and the thing at Tufts was happening, and I immediately got a message from Paisley and several other people saying we have to have a training, we have to do something. So, and this was the time proposed, so this is perfect. So I'm happy that there are many folks here from all different I think there's academics, there's activists, there's advocates, and there's regular folks, which we love. There's really only one kind of folks when you get to it. The other thing that I do is my department, which Rachel Moon is here, also in my department, we provide reality-based information and education from experts on civil rights and liberties topics. The ACLU of Connecticut is committed to civil rights and liberties, democracy, and protecting and forwarding the First Amendment. And knowing your rights is pro-social, healthy civic behavior. I can't say this enough, that I think I've been off video this whole time. I'm so sorry. I can't say that enough, that knowing your rights is pro-social, healthy civic behavior. If someone tells you that it is wrong to know what your constitutional rights are, if they suggest it is somehow controversial to be talking about those rights, right, that indicates a problem, and you need to make sure that you're very attuned to that, right? Knowing your rights, talking about our constitutional rights, knowing what's available to us as citizens and residents of the United States of America is pro-social, healthy civic behavior. You should never be shamed for it. Another thing, I will share this link in the chat. Why is this called a teach-in? For several reasons. Number one, we have several folks that are here that are going to talk about their experiences, and then we're going to have a community conversation at the end where we're all learning from one another. Also, teach-ins helped to teach people the tools that were needed for effective public resistance campaigns when there was government overreach during the civil rights era, or when people were fighting to move the ball forward, right, on civil rights and liberties. So I have an article I'll share in the chat that you can learn more about teach-ins. The other reason this is a teach-in is that this sends a clear message. So first of all, we're going to talk about some important things today, but also this sends a clear message to folks that we learn from history. We think it's important to communicate and talk about history, right? And there's a lot of folks these days that don't want us to talk about our history and be accurate about that. We learn from each other. And reality-based information is important. Context and historical context and understanding is important. It is a tool of authoritarian regimes and of oppressive regimes to decontextualize things and make people feel like that they are alone in time or alone in space. And we're going to talk about why during this protest teach-in, protest movements have been effective globally, and why it's important for us to think about protest movements in the United States in a global context now. So our agenda, we have 10 things on the agenda, but we will be able to get through them all. Number one, we're going to do a quick definition of protest, and the most fun part of this teach-in will be learning about the history of protest. We will walk through history and think about different times where it was popular and effective to protest. We'll also talk about the scope of protest. Why should we protest? Why should we not protest? We will talk about the state of protest in Connecticut, in the United States, and globally. We'll also talk about universities, the current state of protest, and those are updates from literally yesterday and today. I have updates, and those are times when we'll have some folks, Gus and I think Charla will speak during those times. What to expect at a protest. I want people to know sort of there's a lot of lights and sounds and whatever, so I want people to know what elements to expect at a protest. Whether you're new or if this is old hat for you, good to have a reminder. We're going to do a quick Know Your Rights, and I'll show you where you can access Know Your Rights information. I also have a quick Know Your Rights in there for interacting with ICE. We won't go through it step by step, but the resources will be available to you. I'll show you how to find them. We will do a risk analysis, understanding risk. I have a high, medium, and low risk analysis for folks that are planning to protest. And we'll talk about some other things about what your real risk is. A lot of folks think that they may be at more or less risk than they actually are. So I want to make sure that we talk about that. We will go through, I'm working on a document that I can send you all, but we will go through best practices at protest events, and we will talk about what bystander intervention looks like. We're going to use the model they use typically at large universities. It's the 5Ds model. And we will talk about understanding impact. This is a really interesting time in history to protest and could be a very effective time. And so I want to make sure we talk about and understand what that impact can look like. Then the last two things, a call to action. I'll show you where you can find more information about us. And then Rachel Moon will talk about very quickly some ways that you can find protests in your area. And then we will open it up. We'll probably have an hour or more, should we need it, for Q&A, and then community teaching and conversation. So I know this is a lot to go through, and I am going to ask for your attention here for about 20 or so minutes, and really probably without interruption, but you can register your questions in the chat and we'll go through them. But I want to get through sort of all of this. This is recorded. We will not record most of the Q&A section so that folks can speak freely, but this part will be recorded so you can refer back to it. And I'll make sure that there's a way for folks to get the resources that I reference here after this meeting. We'll talk about that today as well. All right, let's get into it. Number one on our 10 things, our list of 10 things. Number one, protest. Definition. So here's the Merriam-Webster definition of protest, right? A public demonstration of disapproval, making a statement or gesture in objection to something, and you can call it a redress of grievances. You can call it lots of things. The definition I prefer is, oops, I guess it's not in here, but the definition that I prefer is a public action that is designed to have some type of impact. And it could be registering in objection to something, right? But sometimes protests are positive, and they can be like in solidarity for things. They are typically registering an objection to something, whether that's authoritarianism, the Muslim ban, war, genocide, could be a lot of things, corporatism, a lot of things, but there are positive protests as well. So features of a protest, things that lets you know that what you're looking at is a protest, right? It is collaborative and organized by people, right? That's probably most of the protests that you all are about to embark on are in that stage where they're being organized. It is attended by people and it is a cooperative event, right? It is not follow the leader. It is sort of follow the group. Everyone, there may be different types of groups there for different reasons, right? But everyone is protesting together. A protest seeks to influence or achieve something. That can be a policy, public opinion. That can be to protest the overreach of the government or the type of government in a country. And it can seek to influence or achieve certain actions by the public or people, or demand accountability, etc. Other features, protest takes many different forms. Boycotting, the letter writing campaigns, you can do a statement, you can have a rally, you can have a march, you can have a public campaign, you can have sort of a behind the scenes different type of protest campaign. There's all kinds of different ways to protest. We're mostly today talking about public mass protest actions. Protests have been used throughout history, right, with a lot of success and varying degrees, and all different types of people throughout all of human history have used protests to register complaints and make their voices heard. Protest typically is part of a strategy. We'll talk about this, right? Like doing a protest just to say you're mad about something is a fine thing to do. But a protest can also be part of a larger strategy to achieve movement on an issue. And we'll talk about that more in depth. Protest involves risk, right? Even if protest is legal in your country and welcome in certain parts of your country or in certain areas like public property, right? There is still a risk to protest. That can be anything from a risk to your person, right? Like someone driving a car into a protest or whatever, a risk of arrest, right? Or state violence or police violence, right? Or a risk to your reputation, or a risk to if your protest is not successful, right? Like that, you could be subject to increased surveillance. There's all kinds of risks associated with protests. There's a lot of rewards associated with protests as well. And then protests, also a feature of protests is they have various tactics and various degrees of effectiveness or efficacy. And then when a protest is part of a systemic movement, right, that is typically called a civil resistance movement, or a nonviolent resistance movement, when it is nonviolent mass protest action. That's when it's part of a movement. But protest can be on its own or part of a movement. At the ACLU, because we strategize often about policy and achieving actual things for people that to make people's lives better in Connecticut, we use protest often as part of a larger strategy. All right, history. Here we go. My favorite part of protest, besides for actually protesting, my favorite thing is learning about how they've been successful throughout history. So there are many places and times in history, and I do want to acknowledge that this has a bit of like a white European bias, because of the amount of history and research that's been done there in academic circles. But we're starting in 1381. And there was a peasants' revolt where the peasants and urban poor in England overtook London for a short amount of time, and were able to make some demands. They were pro-labor protests, and this was one of the first times in this section of the world in history that they had floated the idea of having a life without of a world without masters. In 1517, we know Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation is a very famous time in history, and he registered a protest by challenging the authority of the Catholic Church via protest. He did that in Germany throughout, and he went to many different churches, starting in Wittenberg at this church in Germany, very famous, Martin Luther. In December of 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is where property owning white men appropriated native garb and poured like 300 containers of tea into Boston Harbor. The chant there was "No taxation without representation," which is still on the license plates in Washington, D.C. And one of the quotes there was, "Anyone that is unloading or vending tea is an enemy of America," back in 1773, right before a revolutionary time in America's history. At similar time, just across the pond in 1789, we have public actions. There were many during the French Revolution, but storming the Bastille was one. This is where folks, the Bastille was a jail, a prison in Paris that George Washington famously had a key to, that he kept at Mount Vernon. And folks were protesting wealth disparity and their form of government, and stormed the Bastille, where they had many folks locked up for their political views. And the chant there that is still, you can hear throughout the streets of France today during protests, "Liberté, égalité, and fraternité." In 1848, we have the Seneca Falls Convention, and then use public protest as part of a multi-year strategy, right, to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. This is women's suffrage, and when women got the right to vote, so votes for women then, and there was a multi-year, multi-generational public protest campaign. And we know that it was a very inequitable campaign, by the way, for women that are not white. And then in the 1960s, everyone knows civil rights, and a lot of our tactics and the nonviolent resistance methods we learn were from when India was overturning its British colonist rule, and a generation or two after that, a lot of those tactics were used here in America for the civil rights movement. And in August of 1963, very famously, Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech at the March for Jobs and Freedom. And then in 1965, so there were many issues. Civil rights is encompasses many issues, including economic stability, racial justice, things like that, but also, of course, voting rights. Voting rights are a cornerstone of our democracy. And for folks that are doing pro-democracy protests, right, you should remember that 60 years ago this month, in Selma, there were marches for voting rights, and as they crossed the bridge, they're marching towards Montgomery on March 7th. They called it Bloody Sunday, and that is when protesters were subjected to police violence, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of violence that can happen in a protest. This one was police, and so state-sponsored, taxpayer dollar-sponsored violence. And you can see down below on the bottom left, the top two photos are of the marches in 65 in Selma, and then the bottom left is a march in 75, and you'll see Dr. King is not there, but Ms. Coretta Scott King is there. And you'll see the bottom right is an ACLU rally in Selma for the 55th anniversary 5 years ago, and that we are still fighting for voting rights today. And if you are interested in voting rights protests, we are working hard on our voting rights work here in Connecticut, and are hoping to deliver and protect the promise of Selma here by making sure that our Connecticut Voting Rights Act gets funded. So making sure that you all are aware that there are still voting rights issues going on, even in a state like Connecticut, and we do need your voice to be heard throughout history. So also in the 1960s, you see a lot of anti-war protesting opposing the United States, opposing our business in operations in Vietnam. And there were all different types of protests, and a lot of those protests, as we know, they were part of that like countercultural, very famous movement, and a lot of that happened in universities. We also know there were violent protests at universities where the National Guard was deployed against student protesters at Kent State University, very famous during the Vietnam protests. And a very, very scary time where the National Guard opened fire on American students. So in the 1980s, we had anti-apartheid protests, and those happened. The one on the top left here that we see is from Georgetown University in 1984, when Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is still the elected representative for Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives, made sure that anti-apartheid protests could continue at Georgetown University and throughout Washington, D.C. The bottom left photograph that we see is the same time, but in the UK. And those were in support of Nelson Mandela and against apartheid. And then you can see in this vein we have of universities being this hotbed for student activity and protest activity in the United States. You see this one, we're waiting for Harvard's decision on its investments in apartheid since we began this vigil. So that was in the early or the mid 80s as well. So what is old is new again. And I think this context, is really, really important for us to understand. I think it helps folks have a lot of bravery and courage when it comes to protesting, to know that you're really part of this long lineage of folks. And it's the same types of fights and the same verbiage, right, that we see today. In the late 80s and 90s, 1989, of course, I actually don't have a picture on here, was Tiananmen Square, but in Eastern Europe and in Russia, we had the protests against Soviet rule. And then the bottom left is we had the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was sort of a psychological signifier of the end of the Cold War for a lot of folks. A very interesting time in history to study if you weren't alive then. But what we see here is the other two photos are anti-Soviet protests. And those were ones that they were protesting like trade, commerce, very similar to the tariff sort of protests that we see today. In the 2010s, we had the Arab Spring, which cannot be overstated what a revolutionary time that was For folks, that is also when a little app called Twitter was first sort of coming into the public mind. And so the Arab Spring is a almost perfect encapsulation of the 2010s internet's ability to amplify protest around the globe. The Arab Spring was not being covered by mainstream media and was being covered by folks on the internet and on Twitter. And as such, really sort of a lot of the ways that we seek information and get information on social media today, and a lot of the protest information we get from there is a direct result of how popular and successful the Arab Spring communications were around the world. And that was early Twitter. That was like 09, 2010. And Twitter was brand new then. And we've seen these are protests in Greece, in Venezuela, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, and we've seen the Science March in 2017 that I was at over there. We've seen sort of protests all over the world. We saw Brexit happen. And then in the United States in the 2010s, we saw the Occupy protests. That's the picture, the collage here on the top right. A lot of that, I think you'll see a lot of the same folks and a lot of the same sentiment in some of the protests you'll see today, because that was sort of the anti-predatory capitalism. The chant then was, "We are the 99%," right? And wealth disparity has gotten exponentially worse since then. And it was really unacceptable. And these were worldwide protests that were a very big deal for a while there. In 2014, on the left side, you'll see Ferguson, and we will have a frank conversation. I'm not sure if it'll be during this portion or during the Q&A, but folks from Ferguson, so that was when the Black Lives Matter stuff started first taking off. It was right before Black Lives Matter was like a household name. And a lot of the Ferguson protesters have been are no longer alive, or are no longer working in movements, or can't be found, or have been arrested or harassed by police. There's been a lot of really negative outcomes of that protest, and that's something we should talk about today, right? Like, what does that look like, and who is protesting safe for, who is it not safe for, and what does that risk look like? Again, I can't tell you who can protest, who should or shouldn't, what you should protest, how you should protest, whatever, but we can look at this is, again, why we really have to make sure we know this context, because it is very, very important for people's safety, and for people to make informed decisions. And so people should know that the Ferguson protests specifically, but there are others, but those specifically, the years later that we've seen, the outcomes, a lot of them were negative, but the movement itself was positive, and the world was watching. And then in 2016, I don't know how old most of you are, but if you remember, Standing Rock was huge. This was the fight for water integrity and sacred land for Native Americans in the western part of the United States. And long protests. They were protesting an oil pipeline under their reservation that really didn't meet their safety standards, and they had to work with, and a very good example of coalition across boundaries and across borders. They had to work with really like right-wing property rights rancher folks to be able to make their voices heard. So very unlikely coalitioning there, and very, very successful, and a very sacred protest moment for a lot of folks that study this type of movement work. And then in 2020, most of you, I'm sure, know in the midst of COVID, we had that summer, we had the George Floyd protests and quite a bit of unrest. And then we've also had many other protests I didn't mention here, but those are just some ones I want to make sure that we keep in mind as we're thinking about how we have to think about how we think about these things, right? So this is pretty important. And then today, so today we have Mr. Mahmoud Khalil, arrested earlier this month at Columbia University. We have protests at Tesla dealerships nationwide and now globally as of this weekend. And there's like a growing appetite, right, for public action and public protests. But we're also seeing some retaliation, right? We're seeing the person taken at Tufts. We've seen protesters get arrested. Um, and we know that today, the other thing coming up is next Saturday. There's been a lot of protests this weekend, but next Saturday, there's a big protest. They're all over the state and all over the country, and that's the hands-off protests on the 5th. So if you are participating in that action, I hope you understand that you are really part of as long as humans have been alive, we have been protesting the gross, egregious overreach of power and unfairness, and we have been trying to help our communities and have a better life for a lot of people through protests. So I hope you will take the time seriously. I have a lot of fun at protests. I love doing them, but I hope you will also take it very seriously and understand that even though you can't see folks, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the global impact as well. Even though you can't see people, there are people all around the world that are asking for us to protest and really want people to stand up for what they believe in. All right, so that's number one of 10. That's probably the longest section. I promise we'll get into the conversation soon. So next is we're going to talk about why to protest and then also why not to protest. And I will ask, let me make sure that Gus is here. Okay, Gus is here. Gus, I'm going to ask you and Charla to unmute at some point pretty soon here. So, all right. So why do we protest? And why should you protest? And how should we think about protesting? So protesting is an expression of a position on a specific issue, right? So if you have something you want people to know that you are for or against, then you can express your position on a specific issue via protest. The examples of that are pro-choice protests, that's an issue-specific protest. Anti-DOGE, right, is a specific issue. And then a Standing Rock that we just talked about, that's an issue-specific protest. You can protest in favor, a pro or con or against a specific policy. And an example of that, is the Trust Act. And I'm going to ask Gus to unmute and talk a little bit about the Trust Act. And we'll talk a little more, Gus, about this in the protesting in Connecticut section, but I want to talk about it now. So talk about how protest is used as a strategy for policy.
Hi, can you hear me? Excellent. So, yeah, from a policy standpoint, the Trust Act is a sort of a legal piece of legislation that is moving through the General Assembly right now. It's building on laws that were passed in 2013 and 2019 by the Connecticut General Assembly that works to limit and restrict the ways that the state law enforcement agencies, municipal police can work with ICE. Specifically when it comes to sharing information about a person's immigration status here in Connecticut. That's sort of like the policy standpoint. From an organizing standpoint, from a protest standpoint right now, particularly in the time we are in right now. Well, let me back up a little bit. So the last version of the Trust Act that was passed into law was in 2019. Which was in direct response to the actions of Donald Trump during his first administration. And the version we're looking at right now is continuing to look at how we can protect people who are living in our state, people who are immigrants, people who may be undocumented, so that they are not rounded up by ICE and by federal law enforcement and potentially deported. There's a bill that's moving through the legislature right now. Oh my God, I'm blanking out the name of it. If you give me a second, I can come up with it. But there's been a group, it's called the Trust Act No Coalition, that has been organizing around this issue over the last maybe 3 or 4 months. They've come together in a really quick way, made up of a bunch of groups: Connecticut Students for a Dream, ACLU of Connecticut, Hartford Deportation Defense, a number of groups from all over the state who are looking to make sure that people who are in Connecticut are protected when it comes to their immigration status and not at risk of being potentially rounded up, put into um, detention facilities and possibly deported. So we had a march at the beginning of March, a march in March, makes sense. But the first week of March, we had a big demonstration. We had a few hundred people show up in Hartford to march from the city hall in downtown Hartford over to the Capitol. And then on the front side of the Capitol, we had a bunch of legislators, activists talk about why a new version of the Trust Act was so important. And that's really important right now because legislators need to know that their constituents and their people have their back right now. We saw this in 2020 when the Police Accountability Bill was passed. Something that not a lot of legislators are necessarily courageous about standing up for. I'm not trying to say that legislators are cowards in any sense of the way, but legislators will act with more courage and bravery when they know that their constituents have their back, when they know that standing up for something may not necessarily jeopardize their reelection in a year. And so we had a number of legislators come out and they could see that, hundreds of people were at the Capitol telling them that this is what members of the public, this is what people in Connecticut want right now, is they want to know that their legislators are going to stand up against the Trump administration. They're going to stand up to protect immigrants here in our state. And they legislators, I think, need to do that because especially during the session where they can get very insular and they can, they're in public hearings and they're inside the Capitol and they're not necessarily interacting with their constituents in the same way that they do during like a campaign season or during elections necessarily. So they need people to come to the Capitol and remind them this is what we want you to be working on right now. Um, B, is there anything else you want me to talk about specifically around the march or anything else?
No, that's perfect. I will have you talk a little more when we talk about Connecticut specifically. I've got some photos of the march. And then Charlotte, I'm going to have you talk about some of your resistance during Trump 1 when we talk about national protests. So thank you so much, Gus, and we will talk to Gus and Charlotte and Rachel here in just a minute. Thanks, everybody. All right, so let's keep going on our scope here. Let's see, make sure. And I've been looking at the chat. It looks like everybody's Rachel's taking care of folks in the chat, but let us know if you have questions. So again, in favor of a specific or against a specific policy. And Gus has just explained to us exactly how this works here in Connecticut and exactly how it worked last week in Connecticut. And then, of course, the police accountability in 2020 was, I think, the biggest win that we've had. Other reasons people protest, the scope of protest is to express a view or an opposition to a specific view. So different a little bit than an issue, right? Like an issue can be like pro-choice or anti-DOGE, right? A viewpoint's a little larger, so like pro-democracy, anti-apartheid, things like that. In response to current events is another great reason to protest. And we'll talk about that specifically in the Know Your Rights section. For example, the event next weekend, the Muslim ban protests. I mean, people, if anyone remembers from Trump 1 in 2017, I mean, people went to the airports lickety split, just like that. Lawyers, families, community members, regular folk, anybody just went to airports that it was available to, and they flooded international airports to make sure that people were able to know what their rights were, and that they looked like they had some support from Americans, and was a really successful. And the ACLU, of course, filed 28 legal actions and had the most success during the Muslim ban. We've filed over 400 legal actions during the Trump administration the first time. So counter protesting is another reason to protest, right? So let's say that there's a bunch of, just as a thought exercise, let's say there's a bunch of pro MAGA Elon Musk fanboys protesting, outside your local diner or school or church or town square, and you decide that you want to have a protest to make sure people understand that those people are extremists and are not popular, and you counter protest. So that's a way, an effective method of protest at times. Another example would be Westboro Baptist Church, right? A lot of times they show up to like against drag story hours and things like that. And regular folks just like us, will go and protest. And they oftentimes the counter protesters will outnumber the Westboro Baptist Church folks. Pro-democracy is another reason to protest. We see this globally, right? I have a photo in a future slide, but in Hong Kong, we've seen in 2019 especially, but we continue to see real struggle for democracy. Places like Korea, a lot of places in the world. And we want to make sure that I see you, Paisley. I'm trying to get you where you can unmute. Oh, you didn't have your hand up. Okay, good. But a lot of places in the world have pro-democracy protests, and we really want to make sure for folks that care about the rule of law and care about democracy and kind of see the storm clouds gathering with this Project 2025 business, you want to make sure that you are really clear that people across the globe have to often protest for democracy and in defense of their democracies. We have it pretty good in the United States. We haven't had to do that as much, but a lot of folks in a lot of countries have to do that. And again, just making sure we're placing ourselves inside of this larger struggle is really, really important. The folks that the sort of anti-intellectual folks and the authoritarians, right, would really have us forget that people have had power and have been able to move the needle on stuff for a long, long time. So it's just something. Oh, it is in this slide, this photo. So these are the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, and those were like after sort of the big Valent thing had died down, right? Like this is sort of the second and third round of it. And so again, marathon protesting and mass action for democracy around the globe. So mass movements can change or preserve the political structure of a country. I want to make that very clear in this teach-in. Mass movements can change or preserve the political structure of a country. If you like the fact that we have a functionally representative, for better or worse, sort of put together with paper clips and scotch tape democracy, represented democracy in this country, mass movements can make sure that you let people know that democracy is important to you. And things like, I don't know, the richest man in the world being unelected and having access to all of your private data and, basically the entire national security apparatus for domestic and foreign policy. You may want to remember that mass movements can change or preserve the political structure of a country. Again, why protest? We're moving on, but express a position that is in opposition to your government, right? Mass movements and protests is good for this because you can do it publicly with other people. So you're not alone. It's not a David and Goliath situation. It is a David and Goliath situation, but but the more Davids, the better, right? And to raise awareness for certain issues, the Trust Act is a great example of that just last week. Some people protest is a moral or civic calling, right? Some people voting is a moral calling or a civic calling. Some people, there's all kinds of reasons people do things, but some people feel very compelled to exercise their voice through protest. And then again, to change things. Okay, so that's sort of why we protest. Why would you not protest? Right? And we're going to talk about this in the risk section. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through here. Personal risk is a reason not to protest, right? Now, there are many comfortable white people who might think that they are at extreme personal risk who are not. We will talk about that, right? Then there are other people, all different types of folks that may have significant personal risk for protesting. We'll talk about that. This includes various immigration statuses. And then why not to protest if there's a personal risk? What is the risk of police or crowd violence, right? There are different places in the country where and different types of protests that are more or less susceptible to different types of violence, right? So understanding why that you may not want to protest for that reason, right? Is there a retaliatory risk of violence? That's what we were talking about with Ferguson earlier, right? These are just things to think about. It's not to scare you. We will do a risk analysis. By and large, protesting is necessary, good, healthy, pro-social behavior that is perfectly safe. But there's plenty to consider. So I just want people to think about this. Also, there's an efficacy risk, right? Will your protest be effective, right? We take that risk. This hands-off thing next Saturday is a big risk. This is apparently going to be the largest national action since 2017. So, will it be effective? Is the protest nonviolent? How can you be assured of that? And what does efficacy look like in that context, right? What form of protest is most effective for your cause? at the time, that making sure you know what that looks like. Sometimes protests can be silent, right? Like they have sit-ins, they have all kinds of things, or silent marches. They have those, and they have the loud rallies with the bullhorns. So what form of protest, right? Who is at risk because of this protest, right? It's like that's a good thing to think of. Like sometimes, especially for folks on the call that have white privilege and are used to or developing a practice of interrogating that, right? Making sure you understand who's at risk because of your protest is really important. There were some issues with the Occupy protests at the beginning. Overall, they worked themselves out, but there were some issues with the Occupy protests back in the day, in the beginning, of who's actually at risk and who's actually paying the price for this, because they were anti-predatory capitalism protests, but they would often shut down city centers. So folks, single moms working 2 jobs at a Starbucks or at an office there, people like that, were a little bit SOL during Occupy. And so, the movement really had to think about that. And there was some efficacy risk there. And they got some publicity at the time. And then, is your messaging clear? My favorite thing to talk about. Some of the folks on this call know that. But making sure that your messaging is clear, and that what you all are protesting makes sense with the moment. And for example, the science march, right? Like there were doctors, there were healthcare workers, there were policy people, there was drug policy people, there were cancer researchers, there were OBGYNs and abortion providers. There were all different kinds of people at the science march. And with all different kinds of messages, but making sure that overall messaging was clear was a really positive thing from that moment. All right, going on to number 3, 3 out of 10, 30% there. And the last 2 are just us hanging out at the end. So 3 out of 10. So state of protest globally. So Charlotte, get ready to talk about Trump 1 because you're up next. The state of protest globally. Right now, and this is as of March 30th, 2025, things are changing by the day, but we have seen like pro-Ukraine rallies, and we have seen those pro-democracy rallies continue all over the country. We've seen recently some very affecting imagery from protests in Turkey against their government overreach. And we've also seen elbows up. Any of you Canada fans or hockey fans out there, right? Get your elbows up, right? Canada and Detroit just last week they spoke to one another across the river and stood in solidarity. So I thought that was nice from our friends up north. Very kind of them. So and there are protests sort of happening there globally. Other things happen. This is yesterday. So this is an update. These are yesterday. Yesterday, there was a global day of action against the richest man in the world, who has availed himself of most of our government data, and has been unelected and put himself in positions of power in the government of the United States. And there were global protests against this man, if you can believe it, all over the globe just yesterday. So there were several of those actions. We saw, I think there was like 2,000 protest actions in the United States in the month of February. So Charlotte's going to talk to us a little bit about Trump 1 and protesting in Trump 1. But we are seeing a lot of different types of protests. In the middle of the screen on the right, you'll see some folks are burning the Tesla charging stations, right? And then some folks are protesting various things in the streets, as you'll see at the bottom of the screen. But then you'll also see that folks are rallying around known leaders in this space, right? There's Senator Bernie Sanders and House of Reps Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are on an anti-oligarchy tour around the United States. That they are sort of fundraising. Now, interestingly, and we'll talk about the efficacy of protest at the end, of whether like ones that are sort of with a political party, right? Or ones that are just a protest, a populist movement, which ones are more effective. But there is a large protest movement being sort of sponsored by these two folks that are members of the Democratic Party. So that's happening in the United States. And then I'll talk about that in a minute. And then Charla, let me find Charla. And if Charla did quite a bit of very effective organizing and protesting during Trump won. And so I would love for Charla, who's with CT Shoreline Indivisible, and has done really amazing work in the immigration space here, also in Connecticut for a long time as well. But let's hear from Charla about sort of the current state of protest in the United States and how that looks versus what she knows from Trump won.
Hi, everyone. First of all, great presentation. Thank you so much, B-Ray. I love feeling like I'm part of an essential element of the government that actually, I guess we're the fourth arm, right? And the others aren't functioning right now. So we did a lot of protesting under Trump one. I work with immigrants. We did a lot of stuff that was incredibly effective. Some stuff that we did personally, I feel like I need to turn my anger into action. Otherwise, I just melt and I don't want to get depressed. I like the oppression and cruelty against so many people that I love. There's just too much for me to do nothing. So that's what pulls me out. And then there's, the dissent is patriotic. Like if you look back, I mean, I go to Varick Church on Sunday mornings, and it's a black-led, predominantly black church in downtown New Haven. I mean, these are people that nobody handed rights to people of color in the United States. And unfortunately, we're back to the 50s, and it's not just people of color. It's gay people, it's women, it's poor people. I mean, just the assaults are insane. So I can't not protest. One of the things I learned early on, first of all, making sure that to have meaningful impact, to align myself with grassroots groups that have a plan. And so I worked very closely with Unidad Latina and Acción. Connecticut Shoreline Indivisible worked closely with them. And they predominantly Spanish speaking people. And their protests are everything from wage theft to somebody thinking, that would be somebody at a restaurant thinking they can pay somebody $2 an hour because they're undocumented, even though that's not legal, but feeling like, what are they going to do? They have no recourse. So to stand alongside and support people in those kinds of daily struggles makes a huge difference. But one of the things I learned about protesting is you can go because you're mad and you want to scream with other people, and that's great. That'll get a job done. But there's also something about being part of a campaign, and that's what we did with Unidad Latina, was take specific cases. There was one of the families, they decided they wanted to do a hunger strike because there was a woman who had been here for 20 years and she was at risk of deportation. And so, we sat down and strategized like, okay, if 10 people don't eat, nobody cares. If 40 people don't eat, nobody cares. You have to make it a campaign. And so we did a huge campaign where we took over the step of the federal building in Hartford, and we pitched tents. And, we had the media there right away. We had the white coats showing up to do blood pressures, even though, there wasn't really a great risk. It was like a 4-day hunger strike. But every hour on the hour, they, hit a gong and talked about why they were there and how they were going to stay there until hearing the final word on whether or not this woman had to be deported. And, we turned it into a very visual thing. And as it turned out, the woman was supposed to be getting on a plane on a Thursday morning. On Wednesday night at 4 p.m., we got word from the lawyer that she got a stay, meaning she would not be deported. And it was on live TV. And so, like, what a powerful moment. I mean, ultimately, we feel like with ICE, the best thing you can do is shine a spotlight. I mean, they're going to behave better if they can't do what they're doing in the dark. So I don't know if that's true for the rest of the administration these days, but like I said, part of it is just personal. Like if I'm not doing this, I'll just be falling apart. Like I have to fight for people. There's too many people I care about who are at risk. So yeah, I mean, and like B said, there is a risk. I think there's less of a risk for, people who are privileged in one way or another, either because you're white or because you have money or because you have citizenship. But it's something to consider. And different rallies will have different risks. You know, we also did some civil disobedience, and I never thought I would do that, but that was very planned, very well planned, and I think pretty effective. So, we're stronger together. Find your group, and the media. Somebody was asking about the media. Um, you got to find your allies. I mean, not everybody's going to cover, especially, journalism these days. The turnover is so great. There's no money there. You know, um, invest in your local media. Subscribe to the Hartford Current. Hartford Current does pretty good coverage, and if you get coverage from the Current, you can also get international coverage, or national and then international. So subscribe to local media, and then befriend the journalists. So that's
Yeah,
that's about all.
that's one of our strategies too, is, the journalists are the ones who decide what's newsworthy. Despite my best efforts, I can't just tell them something's newsworthy. So, making sure that this is, again, we'll talk about this in a minute. I'm going to go a little faster through this so we can get to our conversation. But Charlotte's exactly right, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate that it's this moral and civic calling. Charlotte and I have really bonded over that. And we've also bonded over the fact that this is us being patriotic, right? A lot of people want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, screw America, we're done, blah, blah. And I do understand that. But for some of us, like it is that modeling the behavior, right, that you want to see. And so this is the type of American that I want to be, is the type that can go stand up for what I believe in, and believes in everybody's right to be able to do that. So, but all right, well, we will keep moving. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I really appreciate it. All right, here we go. We've got just some more time, and then we're going to get to the talking, and we can all spill the tea, and it won't be un-American as it was at the Boston Tea Party. We can all gossip about protests amongst ourselves. All right, so the other thing that we need to know about the state of protest in the United States, and these are brand new things that have come out, one in the past week. There are new studies about the attitude toward political violence is changing. So the People's March was right after inauguration of this year. It wasn't as large as the Women's March in 2017, but it did have more than 10,000 activists and protesters coming to Washington, D.C. So the Brookings Institution did and I think Rachel will probably put these sources in the chat. I think if I've got them for them, I'm not sure, but and the Brookings Institution did a study, and the folks have reported that about a third of people think that things have gotten so far off track that Americans may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. That's what 33% of folks, surveyed in that moment by Brookings. But like Brookings has a pretty good methodology, research methodology that pretty much passes certain muster for rigor. And so that's a pretty concerning statistic there, right? And so making sure that we understand, there are many different types of protests, and it is safe and perfectly healthy civic behavior to talk about all the types of protests and to learn about them, right? But when we're talking about what types of protests we want to engage in, this teach-in anyway is really going to guide folks toward strategy and nonviolence. However, as we've seen January 6th, and we've seen now folks are starting to talk about it more and to feel like it's inevitable. And that is something we need to know about our country. And quite frankly, how you behave at protests it can make or break some of that attitude, and how the folks that you align yourself with behave at protests, right, can make or break some of that attitude. So I would just take that seriously when you're thinking about, now that does not mean be sedate. It doesn't mean be compliant. It doesn't mean you know what I mean? It doesn't mean be a good little protester and blah. That is not what I'm telling you. But what I am telling you is, that much like Scientific American put this out last week, that nothing good, right, can come of this appetite for political violence. And my best professional opinion as an expert, an advocacy expert, and a person has a lot of lived experience in this as well, is that is accurate. And so I really want folks to be thinking about that when you're thinking about the commitments that you have to yourself, your cause, and to protest. Just sort of what you're thinking about as you move through that. So state of protests in Connecticut, pretty relevant for the folks on this call, I think. And we'll talk a little bit about New England, but and universities is after this. So protests in Connecticut is used for, like we just learned from Mr. Marks Hamilton, state level policy issues. That is a picture there of the Trust Act protest last week, last Wednesday. I think Gus is all the way in the back on the left, and our policy director is right behind Tabitha there in the red pants there. So big showing for the Immigration Coalition in the state, and really successful sort of day of action that had a march and a rally. State level human rights issues, say similar, immigration, same. National level government protests, much like I think this hands-off protest is going to be on Saturday, right? And the things that we saw yesterday. And national level issue area protests as well. Anti-DOGE, pro-choice stuff. The right to lifers were protesting at the Capitol last week. The anti-choice folks. On a local level, we've seen the Suffield Library just last week. We had a couple of things that you should know. A policy subcommittee of the town of Suffield's library was hoping to forward a policy that would ban certain books and functionally take away LGBTQ representation, especially trans representation and non-binary representation in their children's programming and book acquisitions. And I got a bee in my bonnet about it and talked to about 10 lawyers at about 3 organizations and wrote a letter sort of line by line dissing that policy. And we were able to get 80 people out to shut down the meeting. They weren't able to have the meeting. It didn't even have a public comment section, but the town hall only had a capacity of 66, and the fire marshal happened to be there. So with 80 people, we couldn't have the meeting. And, we know that we didn't run them completely out of town, and we'll have to deal with this again, right? But a small win is a win. And that was a win in your state for protesting last week. Another form of protest that has happened as a result of that is that the artist that was going to showcase their artwork in the library for the summer has canceled their art show, has donated to the ACLU of Connecticut, and is donating I haven't even been in touch with them yet. I've got to get in touch with them. If you're on the call, hello, and I'm trying to get in touch with you, but to thank you and to ask you to be in our free expression campaign. But the artist is having to cancel his show out of, as a form of protest against what these people are doing, right? So protest comes in many forms, is very effective, even on a local level. And we had I think 72 hours and we're able to get 80 people. And we were able to get lawyers from the ACLU, lawyers from the American Library Association and the Freedom to Read Foundation to help make sure that these people's policy that they had sort of written in the middle of the night, because they're kind of jerks that want jerkish things for their library. We were able to sort of combat them line by line and then show up in force. And that was very successful. So many events are expected in Connecticut in 2025 and beyond, and that includes the hands-off protest next weekend. They are all over the state. If you're involved in them, I'm sure Indivisible folks and the 50501 and the Discord folks, all of y'all, make sure that you're connecting intentionally, in this meeting and with one another so that everybody is able to do that. All right, we're going to fly through a few things. So state of protest in colleges. This is just a quote from folks. This is it from today, from folks at Columbia University that are tearing up their degrees because they're so embarrassed after Mr. Khalil was arrested at the university's response. The ACLU this week, last week, I'm sorry, published a letter from Mr. Khalil, who is a political prisoner being housed. He was in Louisiana at the time of the letter writing, and he has a letter on ACLU.org with this quote about students being sort of the lifeblood of protest and civil rights struggles in countries. We sued on the 8th, which was the day he got arrested. His arrest has sparked protests nationwide at colleges and everywhere else. Also, we saw a few days ago the Tufts graduate student was detained, and there's been rallies there to get her released. That also has sparked recent protests. And at Barnard College at the beginning of the month, there were some agitator kind of protesters, and like 9 people, I think, got arrested at Barnard, and that was a protest that I was intended to be provocative, I think, and potentially some civil disobedience there. So that one was not. It was like an occupation versus like a peaceful protest. But that one did end in arrest as well. So before we move into risk analysis and whatever, I just wanted to stop and just I will sort of go through quickly the rest of it so we can move on to the conversation portion, because as Charla said, you know, assessing risk and understanding risk is a case by case basis, but we do have some guidelines that we can provide you all. And I want to go through some of the bystander stuff so that you're all feeling safe. And then we will also make sure that you have access to these materials. But I just want to make sure everyone, you know, you remember that the right to protest is guaranteed to us by the First Amendment of the Constitution in the United States. And all throughout human history and all over the globe, even now, people are jailed for protesting. And oftentimes the protests are to make sure that people have the right to things like clean air, clean water, basic human rights, anti-war, non-torture, anti-genocide. I mean, these are very basic issues that people feel like they have to protest for across the globe. And so I just want people to make sure that you remember that this is it is a very, very strong and healthy thing to do to protest, and we must protect these rights, not only with our protest, right, but with our vote, and just sort of with the way we conduct ourselves in our communities. All right, let's move on. So what to expect at protests. We'll go through this quickly, but this is just for folks that have never been to a protest, right? So picture in your mind, we've seen a bunch of pictures of protests, what they look like, right? Like this one in the top left here, or these here at the bottom of the screen, right? So picture in your mind a protest, right? There's lots of people. There will be press and photographers, right? So we'll talk about in the risk analysis, if you don't want to be photographed, you can do many things to obstruct your face, not the least of which are COVID masks, balaclavas and hoodies are also popular, although not as popular, I think, with law enforcement. And you can also drag. There are ways that you can apply makeup and costuming, right, to obscure your identity if you need to do that at a protest. Loud noises you will hear at a protest. You will likely be outside, right? So you'll hear laughter, you'll hear music, you'll hear chants, you may hear yelling, you may hear traffic, you may hear honking, you may hear sirens, you may hear bullhorns, a lot of loud noises, right? So folks that are not used to stuff like that, you just need to make sure that you're prepped for the sensory experience, right? There will likely be police presence. Now, police, and Paisley and her group and I have talked about this, but police presence can be event management, right? There are often police that are in charge of making sure that folks can protest safely and do, right? But then there's also adversarial police presence, which we've seen at many touch points in the United States, including during the first Trump administration, right there by the White House, right? When he came out with the Bible upside down and then gassed the protesters or whatever. So, or the water bombs or whatever it was. So, you know, there are times when police at a protest is a very normal thing. You will see them. They're on the outskirts. They're just crowd control, you know, whatever. And then there are times when it is adversarial presence by police. And that is, you know, you'll have to do that risk analysis. The vast, vast, vast majority of protests right now, as of today in the United States, right, that do not have an adversarial police presence at them. But some do. And notably, typically the folks that's typically communities of color, communities of different economic status and things like that. So make sure that we're aware of that. Also, you can expect at a protest, marching. You can expect protest signs. You can expect potential counter protesters. You can also expect a lack of cell phone service or a need to be without devices. We'll talk about that in a minute. You can also expect accessibility issues. So if you have mobility issues, sensory issues, anything like that, right? We need to make sure that we're planning ahead of time and doing the best that we can. If you need to find where there's a ramp, or you need to find a restroom, or you need earphone, whatever it is, we need to make sure that we're really doing our due diligence ahead of time, so that there's no surprises when you get there. Because There will always be something surprise when you get there, something you'll have to adapt to, right? Other things to expect, weather and public life, again, cars, bikes, buildings, things like that. You will likely have trouble with parking. There will be a long walk at some point. There will likely be no seating. These are things to think about that you can plan for. You can mitigate them. Often you can take an Uber or you can do a car share thing. Some folks have canes that have like seats on them if you have to do that. And there's lots of ways to mitigate issues there. You might run into a lack of restrooms, water, or food, so you may have to take care of yourself that way. There's many ways we can talk about, to do that. The potential to get separated from your group is something to expect at a protest, right? So you want to have a plan for what happens there. And then again, things to expect. You should expect that you need to plan before you go to a protest. You should expect that you're going to have to adapt in the moment. You should expect a need for safety planning, and you should expect various attitudes and types of people. There'll be fun people, happy people, mad people, tired people, all kinds of folks. And so you just need to make sure that you are planning to have that capacity, social battery, the stuff that whatever it is, right? All right, moving on to number 5. Know your rights. You can go to ACLU-CT.org on the screen and click on Know Your Rights to learn about all of your rights. When you click on Know Your Rights, you will see the first 3 things is know your rights for free speech, know your rights for K through 12 public school protests, and know your rights for immigrants' rights. Those are the most recently updated on our website. Also, in the bottom right, you will see things about know your rights that you may just want to refresh, stopped by police or recording the police, things just to maybe think about as we move through this time, right? So when you go to our website and look at those things, you will find a website that has a PDF of knowing your rights for free speech and protests. We update this. We provide the time and date. It is updated. It has the text of the First Amendment. It has where if you can distribute leaflets, if you need a permit. All of those things are in the Know Your Rights section, and that is how you find it on our webpage. Again, ACLU-CT, you click on our work, Know Your Rights, and we're right there at the top. And you can find that, and every time it's updated, it is shown on the new document that it's updated, so you can tell that it's been updated since, with new information. But very quickly, let's go through this. Knowing your protest rights. You do not need a permit to protest in response to breaking news. You do not need a permit to march on the streets or in sidewalks, public property, as long as you are not obstructing traffic or access to buildings, right? A lot of protesting hinges on, legal issues with protesting often hinge on if you were pissing anybody off that was trying to drive, walk, that kind of thing. When you are lawfully present in a public space, you have the right to photograph anything in plain view, including federal buildings. Very famous court case. A guy took a picture of the FBI building, got arrested for it. ACLU represented him, and he was absolved of that charge because you absolutely have the right to photograph, film, whatever. And when you are protesting, you should know that you are likely being photographed or filmed by good guys and bad guys, right? If you believe your rights have been violated, write down everything you remember, get contact information, take photographs, same as if you had a car wreck, right? Stop right there, get all the information down before you forget anything, take a few deep breaths, whatever. And you'll likely be among a group, right? And lean on your group. Folks can really help you, because a lot of folks, if they observe something in a protest, they will likely talk about it. If you get stopped by the police, you can ask if you are free to go. If they say yes, calmly walk away. They will likely not answer you one way or the other. They have many tactics, right, to do that. But if they say you're free to go, then you just calmly walk away. And I would try, and if you are interacting with police at all at a protest, I would move into calm mode, right? Right then. If you get arrested, you have a right to ask why. Otherwise, you have a right to remain silent. It is wise to invoke that right to remain silent and ask for a lawyer immediately. Do not sign anything. Do not say anything. Do not agree to anything without a lawyer present. It may take some time before you get a lawyer present. It may take several hours, right? But you just sit there and wait silently. Anything, they're very serious when they say they will use anything that you say against you. So Be very careful. And if you have any questions about this, I really recommend that people practice. Practice with your friends, practice at home. I've practiced in the mirror many times. You just need to practice. And that way you can move directly into calm mode if you are dealing with law enforcement. Same with military as well. You have a right to remain silent, to presence of attorney, no matter what your status is, your citizenship, anything. So those are your protest rights. And just ask for a lawyer immediately if you are arrested, whatever. A 2025 update to these. I checked with the Immigration Coalition before this teach-in to make sure if they had anything extra for us to consider. And they said that phones have been being taken by TSA. So like if you get detained at a protest and then you're getting taken somewhere, your phone will likely get taken by TSA. So that says to me, right, memorize some phone numbers, right? Write them on your arm in Sharpie, like very, like kind of old school stuff. Understand your specific risk to protesting, where you can protest and on what issue is really important. Same as knowing what gets you on the street. So we want to know what's at risk and why we should not protest, but we also need to know what's going to make us protest, right? Like there's some stuff here going on that we've got to make sure that we stand up about. So what gets you out on the street is imperative. And then intentional community building. This is something I really want to talk about. This is a personal thing I want to talk about with you all. People are afraid. In the last couple of weeks, I've been doing know your rights stuff everywhere. People are afraid to communicate. They are afraid, and this is students, this is faculty, this is people in the communities, this is immigrant families, this is everybody. People are afraid to communicate. They don't know what they can and can't say, blah, blah, whatever. We need to be communicating, right? We need to be talking about our rights, about protesting, acting as if that is normal and healthy because it is. And really that there is this chilling effect on this, and the idea that we live in the United States of America and people think that there's something that they cannot legally talk about is a red flag. So I just want to make sure that folks are really making sure you are communicating about this in ways that are safe and authentic to you. But again, it's a personal thing of mine that, I'm a communications professional. And when I see people that feel like they can't talk about things, and those are the exact people that are getting screwed over by people in power, it becomes a little bit personal. So. All right, moving on. Knowing your rights. The other thing we're going to go through very quickly because I know we want to get to our conversation, but for folks with different status or questions about immigrants' rights, you can also find that ACLU-CT.org. It is where it see this big arrow. That is a link. You can click on immigrants. It will take you to Immigrants' Rights and Resources Guide. This also is updated often, and it has a plethora of resources for folks in the state of Connecticut and in New England. Here are your rights if ICE agents show up at your door and at your work. These are on our website like right here in this immigrants' rights on the website for that. So you can find that there, but it is very similar to being arrested at a protest, right? Be calm, know your rights, do not sign anything, do not assume it's legitimate. Don't assume it's illegitimate. Don't assume, whatever, like, and I've done trainings for folks if you're worried about ICE with different warrants and stuff that we can talk about. But I just wanted to let you all know that's available as far as knowing your rights as well. But for folks with different various status or that are worried about their communities, just know that's available to you as well. All right, understanding risk for protesting, right? This is similar to understanding your deportation risk for folks that have status or don't, right? So a high risk for protesting is people that have been deported before, right? That like you're on some kind of list, right? People that have removal orders that that if they execute those orders, you're leaving the country. People that if you've been here for less than 2 years and you've never made any type of application for any type of status, right? That's going to put you at high risk, right? Also, people that face inequality and discrimination. So not just our immigrant communities, right? That's Black and brown folks, that's trans folks, LGBTQ folks, women. I mean, really, at this point, most folks, but anybody, disabled folks is a really big one because they've got accessibility issues for their right to protest, right? So people who face inequality and discrimination based on anything, age, race, gender, anything, they face more negative outcomes of protests and more risk. And so we want to make sure that we are looking at that. And so when you are looking at your risk, I want you to evaluate what's called your positionality, right? And that is For example, my positionality is I am a white woman who works in the civil rights and liberties like industry, and it's part of my job description, right, to know this information. So my risk for protesting, right, my calculation of what my risk is going to be is pretty low, right? Because even if I get arrested, I have resources to, like, I work at the ACLU, right? So like I have some resources, I have this. So that's how to understand my risk. But people need to know, but also if my car gets impounded, I may not have, I don't make a ton of money. I may not have the money to get my car out of impound if I get arrested at a thing and my car is somewhere overnight, right? So you got to really be thinking about those things about your risk. Medium risk is undocumented folks, or folks of various immigration statuses that have any kind of criminal record, and then other undocumented folks that aren't in the high risk category. Students on the call, you should do a risk analysis if you're protesting on a campus. I've talked to folks on 4 different campuses in the past 3 days, 72 hours. And I've got some folks that feel like if they're comfortable, protesting. I've got some folks that know they have to leave campus and be on exact public property, right, for private campuses. And so you need to make sure you're doing a risk analysis, and feel free to reach out to the ACLU if you have questions on that. Low risk folks. People in removal proceedings from immigration court, right? Because they know that you're going to be showing up places. People with some form of status and no significant criminal history. And then folks who have green cards, refugee status, asylee status, etc. We call that low risk for protesting because it is a low deportation risk, right? That does not mean you're at low risk of surveillance, okay? That just means that you're at low risk of being taken away from the protest at the protest, and being taken out of the country. And then this could change, right? And every protester right now, you should assume that there's some modicum of risk, right? But one of the reasons I really spent like an hour talking about the history of this stuff is to remember that these are calculated risks human beings have made for the entirety of human history. So just keep that in mind. Again, some other ways to think about risk. Number 1 is thinking proactively, knowing what issues could expose you to more risk, right? If you're a wheelchair user, you could potentially be at more risk for violence because you might not have the same exit strategy and opportunities as other folks, right? So like things to think about there. Certain locations could expose you to more risk. For the most part in Connecticut right now, we've seen low risk protesting. But that does not count college campuses. I can't speak to that. Like we're representing Mr. Khalil right now. So, I don't know about that. But certain people or tactics could expose you to more risk. Protests are also going to offend some people, and that's okay, right? How you conduct yourself at a protest is different if you are offensive versus offending people just by virtue of protesting, right? And then I need you to think through, excuse me, think through your response to police opposition, crowd opposition, etc. Right? Thinking this stuff through, playing the tape out in your mind will really help you to know what you're going to do if it starts to feel chaotic, right? The worst thing you can do is have no clue, right? That's the worst thing that you can do. And again, that leads us into talking about safety measures. Where's the location? What are the safety factors and risks? Who will you be with? Who's responsible for your safety and your group safety? What's your plan? Do you know the tactics people are planning to use? And then personal considerations, social risks versus social reward, private versus public action. Are you going to wear a mask? Are you going to be public about it? You're going to post about it, whatever. Your personal convictions, right? I need to do this. This is important to me. And then what's my actual risk? A lot of folks sometimes think they're at higher risk than they are. But also on the opposite of that, a lot of folks, especially now, it's getting very difficult to tell folks, oh, it should be fine, blah, blah, because we're seeing an uptick in these arrests, and especially of vulnerable folks. Very quickly, we're like, give me like 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to have Rachel and Gus say a couple things, and then we're going to get into Q&A. So understanding risk, again, who is being targeted by your protest, if anyone, right? Like that's the question to ask yourself. Historically, anti-war, anti-genocide protest, and like Black Lives Matter, like the Ferguson protests, those are the ones where folks were targeted like after the fact, right? And those are the ones we've seen throughout American history that have been targeted, especially on college campuses. Again, who's being targeted? Universities, immigrant rights folks, and pro-Palestinian folks. We've seen a lot of targeting of them. And then also labor movements. Right now, there's a big push to kill the NLRB and a couple other things. And so there's a big push against labor movements. There's always anti-union stuff with Amazon and everyone else. And then the other thing, understanding your risk, there will be gaslighting from the federal government, right? Like they will say these folks are radicals. Marco Rubio just came out and called like folks protesting for immigration like delusional or something. I didn't see the whole thing, but so you need to make sure that you have psychological girding, right? And the ability to be psychologically sound and know what you're doing and feel really resolved in it. Especially if you're one of those populations, people of color, people of different status, people that have families or can't risk losing a job, whatever that you've thought about that kind of risk. All right, quickly, best practices. What to wear, comfortable clothing, tie your hair up. I'm a big fan of writing down your emergency contact in a Sharpie on your arm, and writing down the phone number. Sometimes, depending on the protest, I change one digit so that like if someone saw it, then they couldn't call it, but I could do, but whatever. But typically it's fine. Masks and goggles, if you want them or anticipate them, there is legislation throughout the country, and including in Connecticut, trying to get it to where you can't wear masks at protests. And the president himself has said that that's something he's against. And then other things to bring, anything you need for safety: water, snacks, accessibility stuff, your ID. And some people bring their ID, some people do not. I typically do. Earplugs if you need them, your signs, things like that. Don't bring your cell phone unless you've turned off your Face ID first. I put mine on airplane mode. I often just leave mine at home as well. And then don't bring anything that you don't want to be arrested with, right? Whatever that is. That can be jewelry, that can be anything. And then if possible, try not to wear contact lenses, just in case there's like a irritant or something like that. Other best practices are have a buddy at the protest, make sure you know what your exits are, and know kind of the folks and know their roles. We talked about that at the beginning of this. And then again, if you're arrested or detained, same thing. This is from the ACLU of Nevada, but I just pasted them here because they're really good. But if I'm detained or while I'm protesting, you just say, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right to stay silent. I will not speak until an attorney is present. If the police won't tell you that they're free to go, that you're free to go, then that's sort of what you say. Refusing a search if possible, but it's really just best to remain silent, and make sure that you don't have any weapons or anything on you. Other best practices, and I have this to send you, this Word document. I made this a couple of days ago in preparation for this. But this is a protest checklist, very, very, sort of what we've gone over. Staying hydrated, dress for the weather, bring your cell phone if you're going to do your cell phone, but if you're not, make sure that you don't, right? Like you have to make that decision. Have at least one emergency contact, know your plan, and make arrangements to keep them posted on your status. Know where you're going to be, how you're going to get there, that sort of thing. And the biggest thing the Human Rights Campaign wants folks to know is know your environment, be prepared to de-escalate. And then I love this four thing, the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act, right? And that's a way to minimize your risk when you're at a protest if you get in one of these like dicey scenarios. And then these are the best practices for universities for active bystander trainings. Most universities use these. They're the 5Ds: direct, distract, delegate, delay, and then disapprove. And those are the best, the 5 ways to be the best, like an active bystander for if something, is going on. Now, if you anticipate being a bystander in some of these things, you need to know what you're going to do if there's police violence, right? Like people need to be ready for that. Now, most protests in Connecticut also have legal observers. And we're working with the Connecticut Bar Association to get legal observers at the April 5th event. Last but not least, and then we'll get to it. Understanding impact. Gus and Rachel, this is where I want you all to talk. And then our call to action is number 9. So understanding impact. Protest has changed the world over and over again. There are recent studies, and the BBC is like on a campaign to try to make sure people in America know this. But 3.5% of a population that is actively engaged in protest can ensure serious political change. Not maybe, not anything, but if 3.5% of the population of a country is actively engaged, right, they can, what is it, Priestley? 2.12 million people. 12 million people, Priestley says. Priestley wants 12 million of us. We can get that for you, Priestley. We can do it. So nonviolent protests also are twice as likely to succeed as armed conflicts. And this threshold is 3.5% of the population, right? 12 million people. There's 100 people here and we're almost 2 hours in. So I truly believe if you guys will listen to this for 2 hours, that we can get 12 million people to stand up for democracy. Okay. But that's what the numbers say on understanding impact. Call to action. So I'm going to ask Gus and Rachel to talk now. Rachel's going to talk about how to get in touch with ACLU. And then folks at the Q&A, you can tell us how to get in touch with your organizations, Paisley's org and Shoreline Indivisible. But I would follow us on social media. Our digital strategist, Rachel's going to talk about that. And then right after Rachel talks, Gus, can you just close us out and talk about like maybe one time that you've really seen protest work that was very meaningful to you? And then we'll move straight into the Q&A from there. All right, now let me so thank you all very much. I hope this is helpful, but let's get Rachel and Gus to close us out. They're much smarter than I am. So we'll do that and then I'll hear from all of you who are much smarter than the rest of us all put together.
Hello. Yeah, so my name is Rachel. I'm the digital content strategist at the ACLU of Connecticut. So by obligation, follow us on Instagram. We are on Facebook. We are also on X. You don't have to follow us on there. We are on Blue Sky though. We are on TikTok. We're on LinkedIn. Absolutely. We are posting regular updates about where you can find protests when we have that information, how you can keep up and know your rights when you're at protests. But the other thing that I wanted to cover very briefly, so there was a few really, really great questions about, what we can do when the mainstream media won't cover protests and that kind of information, or like, how can we mobilize folks? How do we get this information? And Charlotte said something that we are the fourth arm of government, and I'm like, yeah, dude, we are like absolutely. And I want to kind of highlight that earlier B said that, and during the Arab Spring protests, that like those protests weren't covered by mainstream media, but like folks like regular folks like you and I like were on social media platforms covering it. They were talking about what's going on. They were talking about what you can do to support protesters. So we've really seen like kind of like the real power of social media, I want to say. Like, I know it sounds kind of corny, but folks are really like, we've got each other. If no one else has our backs, we've got each other's backs. So with that in mind, I do want to cover three things to kind of remember when you're like searching for that information online. That's pertinent specifically to like protests, whether that's in the form of like rallies, marches, boycotts, whatever. The first thing is that it will take time. I do want to uplift that folks on the chat did say Meetup was a really good place because that's like kind of a social media platform specifically for events. So I want to uplift that because that is 100% a great resource to look out for, especially when like we're in a time where we're just like inundated with so much like garbage information. So it's hard to find like the information that will be useful and helpful to us. So definitely check out Meetup. Check out, honestly, like old school social media platforms like Facebook events. Like people are posting events all the time on Facebook and like Instagram. People are posting events all the time on Instagram too. Um, if you are engaging with an issue more and more, the more and more like that will show up on your page, right? So even if you are not able to attend that event, or even if you're not able to, go to that protest, still like it, comment it, and then hopefully the next day, like you'll be seeing more protests pop up on your page too. It's a very organic way to find that information and come across it. Like, like think of it this way. I'm sure we have all like looked up a thing like I want comfy sandal heels for the next wedding I'm attending, and then looking it up the next hour, the only ads on my Instagram are comfy sandal heels for weddings in the summer. So that's like, think about that when you're coming across these pieces of information on your social media. Like, that's what's going to happen. You're engaging with them more and more. So your algorithm is going to show it to you more and more. So that's really important. The second thing is that like we have an obligation to kind of independently make sure and do our research of like, is this information credible, right? Because again, like I said, like and B said, like there's so much information online. So it and that doesn't have to be anything crazy. You can literally see a post on Instagram, see an event on Facebook, and maybe do like a quick Google search or like a DuckDuckGo search of like, is this the right organization I should be aligning with? Oh, like ACLU of Connecticut has posted this event. They're going to be with Connecticut Students for a Dream, Hartford Deportation Defense. What are those organizations about? Doesn't have to be anything crazy, but just vet the information, vet the groups, and more than anything, trust your gut. I really, really want to highlight what B said about understanding like your risk and kind of thinking about that when you're coming across this information and sharing that information too, because I think we also have an obligation to take care of each other and share the information that we have been able to confirm is good and useful and real. Which is my third thing that I will leave you with is that it will also take community. Like I said before, if no one else has our backs, we've got our backs, right? So if you are seeing information in your community, share it. Put it on other people's like timelines. I think that's really important. I think it's really important that we are with each other in this moment. And I think that the fact that there's like 100 people on this call and Paisley was saying that there were more people trying to get on the call. I think that's really, really important. So these are great, absolutely perfect places to be sending that information. And folks have been doing that in the chat. So I encourage you to keep doing that while we're in this space together and also find ways to connect with each other once this space, has like formally ended, once this Zoom room has formally closed off. And stay with each other and keep each other informed. I think that's a really great baseline because it will take all of us for sure.
It
So
really
that's
will. Yeah.
yeah. So that's
So
what I want to kind of leave you with. Like keep yourself open-minded, keep your search broad. Know that it's gonna take time. It's gonna take some independent research, but more than anything, it will take all of us. So that's what I've got you for now.
that's so great. So the 5051 folks have to jump right at 6 for OPSEC training. So Gus, if you will close us out, and then folks just use the raise hand feature. I've made it to where you can unmute. Just use the raise hand feature if you have any questions. But really quickly before Gus gives us a little taste of how good it can be to protest in Connecticut. There was someone that asked about like if someone approaches you and says you're under arrest, but they're in plain clothes, like what to do. This is a really great reason for those best practices. And I'll copy and paste them in the chat here in just a second too. But making sure you have a buddy system and making sure that someone will know if you, and it doesn't even have to be someone that you know well. You can even just know them for the protest, right? But someone needs to know what happens if you're gone. And if you start interacting with someone like that, you can grab at people that are right next to you, like truly, and just like to make sure, like, hey, someone watch this, someone be watching this. And typically people will do that. But we do want to make sure that folks are really looking out for one another. All right, Gus, tell us one or two quick things, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I'll be super brief. My background is in social work, and one of the ethical values of the social work profession is upholding the dignity and worth of every single human being. And when so many of our rights are under attack right now, I talked about the Trust Act earlier and the rights of immigrants to exist here in our state and our country, but our free speech is under attack right now. Our healthcare is under attack right now. Our voting rights are under attack right now. When I see, every time I turn on the news in the morning, like at home, I can yell at my TV or I can open up my laptop and get pissed off and start pounding away at my keyboard. And that's one outlet, but it's sort of done in an individual way. And what's really effective is when I join together with other people, when we get organized, we're coordinated, we're collaborating with each other, with people that have the same values, the people that are working together, organizing together. That's when you're building power. That's when we all become powerful when we're working together. And that's when change actually comes. I saw this in 2020 when I first started working on police accountability. We saw that happen during the Muslim ban back in 2016, I believe, when that first happened, and then that got shut down by ACLU attorneys within a week of Trump's executive order. And I believe that's what's going to happen right now. There is going to be a pushback that's going to happen. We're just hearing right now sort of like the beginnings of it, but it's coming. So working together, collaborating with each other, coordinating with each other, organizing with each other, that's what builds power.
Thank you, Gus. All right, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, how's it going? My buddy from Meriden.
Hey there, going well as it can be given the reality. Um, so is there, I mean, we were just talking about where to find lists of events that are upcoming, resources, but I mean, I've been yearning for one Connecticut clearinghouse that lists lots, there's some general progressive groups like Indivisible Connecticut, Action Together Connecticut, and I go onto their pages to look for things, but there really isn't one clearinghouse that will list, all the activities, organizations, resources in Connecticut around the social and economic justice agenda, unless I'm just missing it. Does anybody know of any?
So I'm trying to do that, and I'm doing the very best I can on Meetup. So if you
Okay.
wanted to download the Meetup app, I'm trying to list, I mean, things even that aren't in person. So like, for example, May 1st is like give up big banks. So I posted it back in March trying to say, hey, if you bank with Bank of America, if you bank with TD, try to get your stuff out of there, go to a local credit union. The Economic Blackout Day, February 28th, posted on Meetup as an event too. So it'll put it in your calendar. So it'll just populate in your Gmail calendar or whatever. It might be helpful, but join us.
Like,
On Meetup.
I don't use Meetup, but we'll start. Where do I find you in your list? How do I?
It's in the chat, but I'd be happy to, I can
Okay.
interface with you directly. I'm just saying if anybody
Mhm.
else has another option
Okay.
or something else that makes sense as well, please unmute and join. I'm just saying, like, I post all the 5051 stuff, all the county 5051 stuff. So by Wyndham County, Harford County, Talon County, Litchfield County. So you'll know about smaller protests as well. And then things that don't require you to physically be there also. So it could just be a random day and it's like blackout Amazon or blackout Walmart. So
And B, if you just allow me one bit of advertising, I'm co-host of Drinking Liberally Midstate Meriden. There are several chapters around the state. There are over 100 around the country. We get together once a month for some socializing and progressive conversation and some great speakers. For example, Miguel Cardona, former Secretary of Education, will be with us next month. And it's a place we used to get maybe 25 a month last year. Now we're getting 50 because we're talking about fighting back against the Trump assault. The one good thing I appreciate about Trump is he's our best organizer. So I recommend, I put in the chat as well, information about drinking liberally. There's a national website. We can find other chapters around the state. We talk together and plan strategy together. So it's both fun, good fun and good politics together.
Yeah, another thing I'll say is a lot of folks, their town committees, their DTCs, things like that, drinking liberally is a space that's safe for LGBTQ folks all over the country. Indivisible is great to be in touch with. I know Carol Rizzolo at Shoreline Indivisible is putting together a list at some point of all the different groups. 5051 is really good. There's a lot of the meetup groups, like there's a lot of folks trying to do all of those things. And the great thing about Connecticut is there's so much going on, it's hard to know all of it. And that's what we're going to have to keep up. It's going to take quite a lot of energy and a lot of a lot of continuing to do this. Allison and then Joshua, but very quickly, I do want to answer your question, Jim, in the chat. Maintaining the balance between local protests and community, and then mobilizing at a regional or national level, that's really going to be up to you. Most people want to do something on a national level because they're so outraged about what's going on nationally. But as Gus told you, and as we've seen, and I saw last week in Suffield with the library, and Jeff has seen in Meriden with the Human Rights Board, there are ways that you can show up in full effect and change the outcome of small things that turn into very big things. And the great thing about what's going on in our country, it's terrible, but like Jeff said, what the best thing to know is that people are doing these resistance efforts all over the place. And so if you start looking, you will typically find them. I personally think everyone should do at least one local, at least one state, and at least one national, with a focus, if you have to choose, on local. Just because that we've seen extremism really creep into school boards and board of eds and library boards and stuff like that. And that's all very, very local. So that's that. All right. Okay. So Allison next, and then Joshua.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right, great. So I have a question, and if this is off topic, let me know. We could take it offline. I actually sent you an email earlier, B, but it's related to leafleting. What are the basically laws in Connecticut about leafleting on public and private property?
So I did thank you for your email. I did see it just a few hours ago. It's actually in the file I just put in the chat, and I'll put it in there again. In our protesting Know Your Rights, there's a whole thing about leafleting. For the most part, it is legal. There are some different aspects of what is legal and what isn't. And then if you're a candidate, what I know most about is the state election commission rules. But there are other rules. But I'm gonna re-put that file in the chat for you. And that should have it.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, Joshua.
Hi, I think you did just answer my question. It was about the national versus local protest. I guess sort of a follow-up question to that. What are for that national protest? I mean, we're very far away from DC. What do you think are effective ways to make that accessible to more people? Because I mean, a lot of people, they don't want to drive 6 hours to DC.
Yeah. I mean, I think with these big events, with these national mobilizations, a lot of people are they're doing buses. I think it's like $165 to take the bus to DC for this, and with one of the indivisible groups.
Rally is in, like rally buses are already booked
Yeah. Okay.
out
Great.
of Hartford and New York.
Yeah. So I've gone to many a protest in my day via bus, and just taken like the cheapest bus wherever I'm going. I've slept on buses because I couldn't afford a hotel room, like whatever. So that is sort of that. But the thing I will tell you is, if it's frustrating to not have the accessibility for national issues, there's appetite for it. In local stuff as well. There's a lot of these hands-off things going on the 5th. It's not just New York and DC. They're everywhere. And like, it's not just Hartford. I think there's like 15 of them across the state, and so that's like New Haven's having one. I know Danbury's having one. So that, just doing that. And then other times, another way to protest, like there's many forms of protest. You can put a sign in your window, right? You can make a t-shirt. You can have a couple of conversations with folks on your block that you may have never talked to about whatever issue it is. That's how tenants unions get organized, so there's a lot of different ways, but there can be accessibility issues. Sometimes you just have to really be creative, and always just, again, reaching out and communicating with each other about these things is going to be the way to solve these problems. All right, Ashley A, and then Elaine.
All right, can you guys hear me? No? Shit.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Ash, we can hear you.
Sorry. It's a new headset I just started using. So I'm the CT rep for 5051. I know you guys, a lot of things I'm seeing over here and things about the access barriers and stuff like that. So we have an inclusion team that we're working with, and it's we have a few people on this team that are from every background. We have some people from tribal with tribal leadership, stuff like that. We also have some people that are like disability activists on this team. And they've actually the whole point of this team is twofold, is one to kind of advocate to their communities about like some of the cool things that we're doing. But then also it's an internal point where basically they give advice to the leadership staff, like when we are planning these events, like what we can do to be sure that they are being represented and things are as accessible as possible to everyone. So like we've making sure we have seating, like for April 5th, we're going to make sure we have seating in the front for people who cannot stand the entire time. I mean, there might be like a lot of chairs, so we're asking people to bring chairs. Also, just yesterday, we were at an event in East Haddam at the Wrestling Cats coffee shop, and we hooked up with someone who is fluent in sign language, and they work with a team of sign language translators. So we're going to be having someone who is a sign language translator translating the speeches and stuff like that. So we do have like also making sure our events are always at places that are level, flat, wheelchair accessible, that kind of thing. Our supply table team have all downloaded this app called oh my God, what's the name of it? We Can't Hold It. And it's literally an app from the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation that tells all the local bathrooms around you that are like public bathrooms. So if you have to use the facilities, that kind of thing. Um, all of our supply table team members have that info. So there's a lot of things that we've been kind of doing and looking into when we put on these events to make sure it is as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And then also like
I mean, those are the best practices, Ashley. Like that's great. Like having an inclusion team, and visual impairment, mobility issues, hearing impaired, the like the ones we encounter the most here in Connecticut. And so, and then interpretation needs are other ones. But I mean, you all are doing fantastic. I mean, that is exactly, and that is the type of thing you call the ACLU for. Like if you don't know where to start to do all that. You guys have done great. But like, if you don't know where to start to find those people or, whatever, that's exactly why you have ACLU in every state. Yeah. Because we love to help with stuff like that and we're really happy. But yeah, Jeff, the recording of this will be on our YouTube probably this evening. All right, Elaine.
The chat too?
I don't know if it will be, but we are capturing it and I'll make sure that it's circulated. I'll make sure that you get connected with Paisley for sure.
Hi, I just want to first just thank you so much for your presentation and just for being there. Next is, how does 3.5% of the population showing up for a protest, how does that affect the government?
So what we've seen is with like authoritarian and autocratic movements and anti-democratic movements across the globe, if 3.5% of folks like descend on the streets or whatever, it typically showcases to those institutions, right? That they will remain unstable and the people like will not back them by that amount. Like that seems to be the threshold. And we've seen it over and over in history. So like if 3.5% of people are standing up for democracy, that is the threshold to be able to ensure that like democracy sort of holds. Now, I will say, I haven't been able to do a deep dive on the studies fully, and I do know that the United States has a geographical, like we're such a large country, right? Sea to shining sea. It's not, a lot of these countries, it takes an hour, 2 hours to get to the capital instead of 6 or even several days, right? And so it might look a little different in different places, but the point of sharing that is to showcase that, like, if people want, because I can't tell you what to protest, but like if you want to stand up for democracy, basic stuff, you can stand up for lots of issues, immigration, abortion, all the issues we all like stand up for, free speech, all these things. But if you want to do basic democracy, I want to have libraries and the postal service and schools, that kind of, and roads and things like that. If you're going to protest for that, the way to ensure that those that those institutions can remain stable, is to have that percent of the population out.
Great, thank you.
I hope that's helpful. But again, I will say I don't have my doubts about that number and that threshold. What I do know is that America is an awfully large country, surface area wise. And
Great,
I do know that that's going to take some planning and strategy from all of us. Yeah.
thank you.
All right, one more question. Last question. Anybody? Or closing words from Paisley. Joshua, do you have another question?
No, I just forgot to lower my hand.
No problem. All right, Deborah.
Sorry, just trying to get off mute. First of all, I did want to say too, you did an excellent job with this presentation. You were engaging the entire time, and I have a tendency to drift, and you kept me engaged the entire time. So, like, that is such a big deal. But I did see a question in the chat around domestic terrorism, and I had seen a comment that they were going to get you to speak to that. So I just wanted to know if you could speak to that. I am particularly concerned when I hear about folks, protesting and, organizing, that is definitely how you could get yourself potentially labeled as a terrorist. And as someone who is, treated as a terrorist in my regular everyday life, this is not something that I would want for other people. And so I did want to understand, what is, the ACLU or other organizations that you're aware of, what are they doing, for or about, people who are, being mislabeled as terrorists, and, how to prevent that treatment.
That's a great question and a great thing to end on because this highlights the need. This certainly highlights the intersectionality of all of our issues, right? Like the reason people get labeled domestic terrorists often without any evidence or anything like that, right, is because of the color of their skin, their political or religious affiliations. We typically see it's people of color, and folks right now we're seeing in the pro-Palestinian movement and things like that, right? So this is great. It really highlights the need to do these things and continue to do these things. It also highlights the need at the ACLU of Connecticut to reiterate our values. We do everything through a racial justice lens, of just similar to what Gus said earlier, of dignity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that is so important about these risk analyses is to make sure that folks understand, who might be called that and who might not and why, right? And then also to make sure that there is a large enough protest effort in this country, right? So that when people do get called domestic terrorists just for protesting their, exercising their First Amendment rights, right? Then there's enough people standing up and saying that that's ridiculous, right? Because I'm of the real conviction I've really learned over the past, several years here doing this, is and over decades doing this, is that we're going to get the country that we put up with, right? And so that's why places like the ACLU represent people like Mr. Khalil and folks like that. And the ACLU was founded in 1920 because the Attorney General at the time, Mitchell Palmer, was raiding political, liberal, and radical groups and was picking up immigrants and folks that were deemed political radicals, very similar to what we just saw Marco Rubio say a couple of days ago about immigrants and folks that are protesting, right? And so the thing I would tell you is that anyone calling of someone that's protesting for anything a domestic terrorist, right, is that it casts a doubt on those people and on their motives. And you can just throw it right back on them and say, like, that doesn't, like, that's not how this country is, and that's not what we do in this country and what the First Amendment is about. But also, this is a good, really great reminder, Deborah, of what a great and necessary time it is for folks that can stand up to do so. And then also for folks that may be at increased risk or may not want to mess with it. Like if you have too much of this strife in your daily life, right? Like protesting publicly might not be the way that you contribute civically to this time in history, right? And that's okay. But making sure that our protest movements are strong enough that we can absorb folks like you and that you do feel safe when and if you do want to protest, right, is really, really important. So that is a great segue into why the places like the ACLU stand up for civil rights and liberties, and for why that risk analysis is really important, and also for why we must all work together to prioritize people like Deborah in this fight for racial justice and for dignity and diversity and equity and inclusion and the fight for democracy and everything else. So that was a really wonderful thing to end on. So I appreciate you, Deborah, and I thank you so much. All right, I am going to end it there. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. I can stick around a few more minutes if folks have questions, but thank you so, so much. And happy protesting. And I'm grateful to live in a place where we all enjoy these constitutional rights. And I will see you out there. All right, thanks, everybody.
And enjoy it.
And enjoy it. That's right. Enjoy it. It's only fun if it's fun, you know?